The Pentagon's marble floors had seen countless generals, presidents, and decorated warriors pass through its halls. But on a cold March morning in 2024, those floors witnessed something that would become legend. Admiral Marcus Holloway, commander of all naval special warfare operations, a man who had personally led missions in 17 countries and earned 3 Navy crosses, stopped mid-stride in Corridor 4. His entire staff froze behind him. The Admiral's face had gone rigid, his jaw set in that particular way that made even veteran SEALs uncomfortable. But he wasn't looking at a threat. He was looking at an elderly woman pushing a cleaning cart, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, her maintenance uniform bearing the name tag Rays. What happened next would be captured by security cameras and analyzed frame by frame. Holloway straightened to attention, brought his right hand up in the sharpest salute he'd ever rendered, and held it there. The woman's mop clattered to the floor. Her weathered hands trembled as she slowly returned the salute, her movements precise despite the years, muscle memory from another lifetime. The billionaire defense contractor following 3 paces behind the Admiral, James Whitmore of Whitmore Dynamics, went visibly pale. He'd been mid-sentence about a classified contract worth $800 million. The words died in his throat. The Admiral didn't lower his salute. Neither did the woman. The corridor's fluorescent lights hummed in the silence. Somewhere, a distant phone rang unanswered. Holloway's aide, a Navy captain with 2 bronze stars, stood paralyzed, his briefing folder forgotten in his hands. He'd served under Holloway for 6 years and had never seen his commander salute anyone first, not even the Secretary of Defense. Protocol dictated the junior rank saluted first always. The woman's eyes were wet now, dark brown eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. Her cleaning uniform seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by something invisible but undeniable: authority, sacrifice, a past that demanded acknowledgement. Whitmore tried to step around them, uncomfortable with the display, but Holloway's chief of staff blocked his path with an outstretched arm. "Don't," the commander said quietly. "Just don't." The standoff continued. 30 seconds, 40. The woman finally lowered her salute, and only then did Holloway drop his. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute respect. "It's an honor." She nodded once, picked up her mop with hands that barely shook now, and continued down the corridor. She didn't look back. Holloway watched her go, and when he turned to his staff, his expression silenced every question before it could be asked. Whitmore found his voice first. "Admiral, what the hell was that about? Who is she?" Holloway's response was cold enough to frost the air. "That's classified." But classified couldn't contain what happened next. Within an hour, the security footage had been reviewed by 3 different Pentagon departments. By noon, a notice had been quietly distributed to every senior officer in the building. By sunset, the story had leaked, not through official channels but through the whispered networks of military intelligence, the old guard who still remembered when wars were fought differently, when some operations were so black they didn't exist even in sealed archives. Rays wasn't just a janitor. 28 years ago, she'd been Captain Isabel Rays, call sign Serpent, and she'd flown things that officially never flew in places that officially never happened. The F-117 Nighthawk, the first operational stealth aircraft, had been retired in 2008. Most people thought it was the only stealth platform of its era. They were wrong. In 1996, there had been another program, buried deeper than anything before or since. Rays had been one of only 4 pilots cleared to fly it. The aircraft didn't have a name, just a designation: Project Obsidian. It made the Nighthawk look like a training glider. Holloway had been a young SEAL lieutenant then, leading a rescue operation in the Balkans that had gone catastrophically wrong. His entire team pinned down, surrounded by hostile forces, no air support because the weather had grounded everything conventional. Except it hadn't grounded Obsidian. Rays had flown through conditions that would have killed anyone else, dropped ordnance so precise it eliminated the threat without touching Holloway's men, and vanished back into the storm. He'd never seen the aircraft clearly, just heard the whisper of its engines and felt the earth shake. The mission report listed it as unknown allied asset. Holloway had spent years trying to learn who had saved his team. Every inquiry hit a wall. Every investigation went nowhere. The program had been terminated in 1998, all records destroyed, all personnel dispersed and sworn to silence so absolute that most had simply disappeared into civilian life. Reyes had chosen the Pentagon. Hiding in plain sight, pushing a mop past the officers who commanded the forces she'd once protected from the shadows. Whitmore cornered Holloway in his office an hour later, contract forgot, his face still pale but now animated with desperate curiosity. "I have security clearances that go deeper than most senators," he said. "I've never heard of Project Obsidian." Holloway sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes distant. "That's because you weren't supposed to. Nobody was. Congress wasn't briefed. The president at the time barely knew. It was the last true black program before oversight killed everything interesting." He paused, considering his words. The aircraft could fly in any weather, completely invisible to radar of that era, deliver munitions with precision we still can't match, and it could do it from bases that didn't officially exist. Reyes flew 73 missions in 2 years. 73 missions that saved American lives in operations you'll never read about. Whitmore sank into a chair. "Why is she cleaning floors?" "Because she signed papers that said she'd never speak about it. Ever, to anyone, including her own family. The penalty for violation wasn't prison, it was worse, complete erasure. Everything she'd done, everyone she'd saved, all of it would be denied. She'd become a conspiracy theorist, a delusional has-been. So she stayed quiet, took the pension she'd earned, and found work here because this was the only place that still felt like home." Holloway pulled open a drawer, withdrew a thin file that technically didn't exist. 3 months ago, I finally got confirmation through channels so buried I had to call in favors from my predecessor's predecessor. When I saw she was working here, I've been looking for her every day since." Whitmore leaned forward. "Why salute? Why now?" "Because she deserves it. Because the men she saved deserve to have their savior honored, even if only one person in that corridor understands what that salute means. And because I needed her to know that someone remembers." The billionaire sat back, processing. He'd built his fortune on defense contracts, moved billions of dollars through classified programs, shook hands with generals and politicians. But this was something beyond money, beyond contracts. This was the military's real currency, honor and remembrance. "What happens now?" he asked. Holloway closed the file. "Now I make sure she knows she's not forgotten. There are protocols, quiet ways to show respect without violating classifications, a better office assignment, enhanced benefits, small things that acknowledge her service without confirming it officially." He looked at Whitmore directly. "And I'm going to recommend something else. Project Obsidian may be dead, but its lessons shouldn't be. We need to study what made it work, why pilots like Reyes were so effective, how we can rebuild that capability for the next generation." Whitmore nodded slowly. "I can help with that, unofficially. My company has divisions that specialize in advanced aviation programs. If you can get me the basic parameters without violating classification, we can explore modern equivalents." They talked for another hour, 2 men from different worlds finding common ground and honoring a warrior most people would never know existed. When Whitmore finally left, Holloway sat alone in his office, staring at nothing. He thought about that night in the Balkans, the rain hammering his helmet, the impossible situation, the certainty that he and his men were finished. Then that sound, like distant thunder but smoother, more purposeful. The explosion so close he'd felt the heat, but his team untouched. The impossible rescue. He'd built his entire career on the foundation of that night, led SEAL teams with the confidence of a man who'd been pulled from the fire by something he couldn't explain. Now he knew. Now he could at least say thank you, even if only through a salute in an empty corridor. The next morning, Reyes arrived for her shift to find a new assignment notice. She'd been moved from general maintenance to the historical archives section, a quieter posting with better hours and climate-controlled comfort. The notice included a handwritten note on Admiral's letterhead. "Your service continues to matter. Respect and gratitude. M.H." She held the paper for a long moment, then carefully folded it and placed it in her locker. She didn't smile, didn't cry, just nodded once to herself and went to work because that's what she'd always done. That's what warriors did. The story might have ended there, a quiet acknowledgement between two veterans separated by rank and circumstance but united by understanding. But stories like this have momentum. They leak and spread, not through official channels but through the invisible networks that connect military communities across generations. By the end of the week, senior officers throughout the Pentagon had heard whispers. A janitor who was more than she seemed. An admiral's unprecedented salute. Questions began percolating up through the chain of command, careful questions from people who understood that some things were better left unspoken, but worse left ignored. General Catherine Voss, the highest-ranking woman in the Air Force and the current Vice Chief of Staff, made discreet inquiries. She'd heard rumors about black programs in the 90s, operations so classified they'd been run by a compartmented group that reported directly to the Secretary of Defense. Obsidian had been mentioned once, decades ago, in a briefing she'd barely had clearance to attend. Now she wanted to know more. She found Holloway in the Pentagon's executive dining room, sitting alone with coffee and classified briefing materials. "I hear you've been acknowledging old ghosts," Voss said, taking the seat across from him without invitation. Admirals and generals didn't stand on ceremony with each other. Holloway looked up, measured her with experienced eyes. "Depends on which ghosts you mean." "The ones who flew things we're not supposed to remember." Voss leaned forward. "I knew there were female pilots in experimental programs back then. I tried to find them when I was coming up through the ranks, wanted role models to point to. Every trail went cold. Every name got redacted. I thought maybe I'd imagined it." "You didn't imagine it," Holloway said carefully. "But you're right about the trails going cold. That was intentional. The people who designed those programs believed operational security meant absolute compartmentalization. The pilots who flew those missions understood they were trading glory for effectiveness." Voss absorbed this. "Isabel Reyes." It wasn't a question. "I can neither confirm nor deny any specific names in connection with programs that may or may not have existed." Voss smiled grimly. "Admiral, we're both way too senior for that dance. I'm not asking you to violate classification. I'm asking you to help me understand if we made a mistake. These pilots, whoever they were, they deserved recognition. They deserved to be remembered as pioneers." "They were remembered," Holloway said, "by the people they saved, by the operations they made possible. Sometimes that has to be enough." "Does it?" Voss's voice carried an edge now. "I've spent 30 years watching men get credit for classified operations once they're declassified. Medal of Honor citations that come out 20 years later. Promotions and positions based on secret service that eventually gets acknowledged. But the women who served in those same shadows, they seem to stay buried." Holloway set down his coffee. "You're right. You're absolutely right. And I don't have a good answer for that except to say the system was designed by people who didn't think about those consequences. They just wanted operational security. Then maybe it's time to redesign the system," Voss said. "Start with Reyes. If she's who I think she is, if she did what I suspect, then she deserves more than a reassignment to archives. She deserves formal recognition." "That would require declassification," Holloway pointed out. "It would require the Secretary of Defense to acknowledge programs that 3 administrations have successfully kept buried. It would open questions about oversight, about congressional notification, about how many other operations were run without proper authorization. Maybe those questions need to be opened." They sat in silence for a moment, two warriors considering the implications. The dining room continued its quiet bustle around them, officers and civilians engaged in the mundane work of maintaining American military power. None of them knew that the decisions being contemplated at this table could reshape how history remembered an entire generation of secret warriors. Finally, Holloway spoke. "Let me make some calls. There are people, retired now but still connected, who might be willing to have conversations. Not on record, not officially, but enough to build a case for selective declassification." Over the following weeks, those conversations happened in places far from official oversight. A retired Secretary of Defense, now in his 80s, remembered Project Obsidian with surprising clarity. He'd authorized it personally, convinced that American forces needed capabilities beyond what Congress would approve or enemies would anticipate. He'd chosen the pilots himself from a pool of candidates who'd already proven themselves in other black programs. Isabel Reyes was the best, he said over secure phone to Holloway. Better than the men, better than anyone I'd ever seen. She had this ability to fly through conditions that should have been impossible, maintain composure under stress that would have shattered most people. We sent her into situations where failure meant not just mission loss but potential international incidents. She never failed. Not once. Why didn't she receive recognition when the program ended? Because I made a promise, the old man said, to her and the others. I promised that if they did this work, accepted this burden, I'd protect them from the consequences. Declassification would have meant investigations, congressional hearings, media exposure. Their lives would have been destroyed by the attention. So we buried it all, and I've carried that weight ever since. Would you support limited declassification now? Holloway asked. Enough to give them credit without compromising sources and methods. There was a long pause. If Reyes agrees to it, yes, but only if she agrees. We don't make that decision for her. She earned the right to choose. Holloway tracked down the other surviving pilots from Obsidian. Of the four, one had died in a training accident years ago under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. Another had moved to New Zealand and refused all contact. The third, a man named Cole, was willing to talk. He met Holloway at a veterans memorial in Arlington, speaking in low tones while tourists wandered past. Reyes saved my life twice, Cole said. Once in the air when my systems failed and she talked me through a dead-stick landing in conditions that should have killed me. Second time was after the program ended. I was falling apart, couldn't handle the transition back to normal life, couldn't talk about what we'd done. She found me, got me help, never spoke about it but made sure I knew I wasn't alone. Did she struggle with the transition too? Holloway asked. Cole laughed bitterly. She struggled more than any of us, but she didn't show it. She just found work and kept going because that's who she is. Relentless, unstoppable, even when the world had no place for what she'd become. If there was a chance to give her recognition, would you support it? Only if it helps her. Not if it's about making the Air Force feel better about how they treated us. Not if it's politics. If it genuinely gives her something she wants, something she needs, then yes. Otherwise, leave her alone. She's earned her peace. Holloway gathered his information carefully, building a case without official sanction, preparing for a conversation he wasn't sure would ever happen. He needed to approach Reyes directly, needed to understand what she wanted before pushing for anything that might damage the quiet life she'd built. He found her in the archives one evening, working alone among documents that predated her service, carefully cataloging reports from wars most Americans had forgotten. She looked up as he entered, recognized him immediately, and returned to her work. "Ma'am," Holloway said, "may I have a moment?" "You're an admiral," Reyes replied without looking at him. "You can have whatever you want." "That's not how this works. Not with you." She set down the file she'd been holding, turned to face him fully. "What do you want, Admiral?" "I want to know if you'd accept recognition for your service, formal recognition, declassification of at least part of what you did, enough to give you credit, enough to make sure history remembers." Her face showed nothing. "Why?" "Because you deserve it. Because the people you saved deserve to know who saved them. Because there are young pilots, especially young women, who need to know that someone like you existed, that someone proved it could be done." Reyes studied him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried decades of controlled emotion. "I made a promise, Admiral. I signed papers. I gave my word that I would never speak of it, never seek credit, never compromise what we did." "I know," Holloway said, "and I'm not asking you to break that promise. I'm asking if you'd accept others breaking it for you. The former Secretary of Defense is willing to confirm the program's existence. Other pilots are willing to speak. The classification can be partially lifted without your direct involvement." "And what happens then? Media, interviews, people asking questions I still can't answer." "Maybe, probably, but also formal recognition in your service record. Acknowledgement from the Air Force. retirement benefits that reflect your actual rank and service, not the cover identity you maintained, and most importantly, your name in the history books where it belongs. Reyes walked to the window, looked out at the Pentagon's internal courtyard. I stopped caring about recognition a long time ago, Admiral. What I did because it needed doing, because people needed saving. The credit was never the point. I understand that, Holloway said. But there's something else to consider. Right now, the military is trying to develop new capabilities, new programs that might require the kind of sacrifice you made. They're struggling because they don't have role models, don't have proof that people can do this work and survive it. Your story could change that, could give the next generation something to aspire to. She turned back to him. You're asking me to become a symbol. I'm asking you to let your service mean something beyond the missions you flew. You saved lives directly through your actions. Now you could save careers, save programs, save future warriors by showing them it's possible. Reyes was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. I need to think about it. This isn't a decision I can make quickly. Take all the time you need, Holloway said. And ma'am, whatever you decide, the salute stands. You'll always have my respect, public or private. She nodded once and he left her alone with her thoughts. 3 weeks passed. Holloway received no word from Reyes, made no attempt to push her. He'd said his piece. The decision was hers. Then, on a Thursday morning, he found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in precise script. Admiral Holloway, I've decided to accept limited declassification, with the following conditions. First, no media interviews or public appearances will be required of me. Second, any recognition must acknowledge all 4 original Obsidian pilots equally, including Lieutenant Maria Santos, who died in 1997. Third, the operational details remain classified. Only the existence of the program and our participation may be confirmed. Fourth, proceeds from any books, films, or commercial exploitation must go to veterans organizations supporting pilots with PTSD. If these conditions are acceptable, you have my permission to proceed. The promise I made was to stay silent. I never promised to stop others from speaking truth. Isabel Reyes, Captain, USAF, retired. Holloway read the letter 3 times, feeling something loosen in his chest. He'd saved countless lives in his career, led men through impossible situations, made decisions that altered the course of operations across the globe. But this moment felt more significant than almost anything else he'd done. He was giving a warrior her honor back, and she was using that honor to protect others. He immediately began the process, working through channels so classified that most Pentagon officers didn't know they existed. The current Secretary of Defense, briefed on the situation, was initially hesitant. This opens doors we've kept closed for good reasons, the Secretary said. Once we start declassifying old black programs, where does it stop? It stops where we decide, Holloway replied, with clear boundaries, specific purposes, and respect for the people who served. Reyes isn't asking for full disclosure. She's accepting limited acknowledgement under strict conditions. This isn't about transparency for its sake. It's about honoring service. The Secretary considered this. The political implications are significant. Congress will want hearings. The media will dig. We'll face questions about oversight and authorization. With respect, sir, those questions might be worth facing. The military has a credibility problem right now. Young people don't trust institutions the way previous generations did. Showing that we honor our promises, even the classified ones, even to warriors who served in silence, that could help rebuild that trust. The argument resonated. Within 2 months, a carefully worded press release was prepared. It acknowledged the existence of an experimental stealth aviation program in the mid-1990s, confirmed that 4 pilots had participated, including Captain Isabel Reyes and Lieutenant Maria Santos, and noted that the program had contributed significantly to subsequent aviation development. Details remained classified, but the pilot's service was formally recognized. The Air Force simultaneously announced a ceremony at the Pentagon, a private event where Reyes and the surviving pilots would receive decorations that had been authorized but never awarded. The Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, the Air Medal with multiple devices, and a new commendation created specifically for participants in unacknowledged programs, the Shadow Service Medal. Reyes almost declined the ceremony. Holloway had to personally convince her that accepting recognition in person would matter more than any press release. "The young officers need to see you," he told her. "They need to see that someone like you exists, that this life is possible." She finally agreed, but only if the ceremony remained small, restricted to Pentagon personnel and invited veterans. No media, no cameras beyond official documentation, no speeches beyond what was strictly required. The ceremony took place on a Friday afternoon in one of the Pentagon's secure conference rooms. Fewer than 50 people attended, but they included the current Air Force Chief of Staff, multiple generals, and a delegation of female fighter pilots who'd requested permission to witness history. Reyes wore her old dress uniform, the one she'd kept carefully preserved in storage for nearly 3 decades. The insignia was outdated, the cut unfashionable, but when she walked into the room, every officer stood at attention. There was no mockery, no condescension, no doubt, just respect, absolute and unqualified. The Chief of Staff read the citations himself, his voice steady as he recounted missions that had no dates, locations identified only by classified designations, accomplishments described in careful language that revealed nothing while implying everything. When he pinned the Shadow Service Medal to her uniform, Reyes stood absolutely still, her face composed, her eyes distant. She was somewhere else, Holloway realized. Back in the cockpit, back in the missions, back in the moments when she'd been the only thing standing between American warriors and death. The ceremony concluded with a reception, awkward at first as officers uncertain how to approach a living legend made small talk about weather and traffic. Then one of the young female pilots, a lieutenant named Park who flew F-35s, approached Reyes directly. "Ma'am," Park said, "I just want you to know that knowing you existed, knowing you did this, it changes everything. I've faced resistance my whole career, people doubting whether women can handle combat aviation. Now I can point to you." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "Don't point to me," she said. "Fly so well they can't ignore you. Make yourself impossible to dismiss. That's what I did, and that's what you need to do. My existence might open a door, but you have to walk through it on your own power." Park nodded, clearly taking the words to heart. Other young pilots gathered, asking careful questions, listening to answers that revealed little but inspired much. Reyes was uncomfortable with the attention, but handled it with the same competence she'd brought to everything else, answering honestly within the constraints of classification, deflecting praise while acknowledging the difficulty of the work. Holloway watched from across the room, satisfied. This was what he'd wanted, this transmission of knowledge and inspiration from one generation to the next. Whitmore found him there, the billionaire looking almost emotional. "You did it," Whitmore said. "You actually pulled it off." "Did it," Holloway corrected. "I just made sure people knew." They stood together, watching Reyes navigate the reception with the same precision she'd once applied to impossible flying conditions. She wasn't comfortable, but she was handling it because that's what warriors did. They completed the mission, even when the mission was accepting honor they'd never sought. As the reception wound down and people began departing, Holloway noticed Reyes slip quietly toward the exit. He intercepted her in the hallway. "Thank you for doing this," he said. "I know it wasn't easy." "Nothing worth doing is easy, Admiral. You should know that better than anyone." She paused, then extended her hand. "And thank you for remembering, for caring enough to make this happen." They shook hands, two warriors from different services and different eras, connected by the understanding that some debts transcend time and circumstance. Then Reyes walked away, returning to her life, her work, her chosen anonymity. But she walked differently now, Holloway thought, straighter, lighter. Like a burden she hadn't known she was carrying had finally been lifted. The story could have ended there, with ceremony and recognition, with honor bestowed and gratitude expressed. But the best stories don't end. They ripple outward, creating effects far beyond their origin. Within months, the Shadow Service Medal became a symbol throughout the military community. Other veterans of black programs began quietly coming forward, asking if they too might receive acknowledgement for service that had gone unrecognized. The Pentagon established a review board, carefully examining classified programs and identifying participants who could be honored without compromising ongoing operations. Ray's story specifically inspired a new generation of female aviators. Applications to military flight schools increased. Retention rates improved. Young women who'd been uncertain about their place in combat aviation found validation in knowing that someone had done this work before them, had proven it possible not just in theory but in reality. The documentary filmmakers came next, despite Ray's refusal to participate. They made their film anyway, using interviews with Cole and other veterans, animation to depict classified aircraft without revealing actual specifications, and careful narration that honored the truth while respecting classification. The film won awards, generated discussion, and cemented Ray's place in aviation history, even as the woman herself returned to quiet work in the Pentagon archives. But the most significant ripple came from an unexpected source. General Voss, the Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, used Ray's story as leverage in congressional hearings about military culture and equal opportunity. She argued that the military had a pattern of failing to recognize female service members, that this failure damaged morale and retention, and that institutional changes were needed. The hearings were contentious, but Ray's example proved difficult to dismiss. Here was a woman who'd served with distinction in the most demanding circumstances, who'd saved American lives repeatedly, and who'd been systematically erased from history for decades. The political implications were clear. How many other women had been similarly treated? What talent had the military lost because recognition only flowed to men? Congress passed new legislation requiring regular review of classified programs to identify service members eligible for recognition. The military services established offices specifically dedicated to ensuring equal treatment in awards and promotions. Not everyone was happy with these changes, but they happened. And they happened because one woman had accepted limited recognition for service she'd never sought to publicize. Holloway retired 2 years later, his career capped by successful reforms to SEAL training and operations. At his retirement ceremony, he was asked what accomplishment he was most proud of. He surprised everyone by talking not about the missions he'd led or the terrorists he'd helped capture, but about a salute in a Pentagon corridor and the warrior who deserved it. "The best thing I did," he said, "was remember, was acknowledge, was make sure someone who'd served in silence knew that her service mattered. Everything else I've done was just my job. That was something more." Ray's attended his retirement, sitting quietly in the back of the auditorium. When Holloway spotted her afterward, she gave him a single nod of acknowledgement and departed before he could reach her. But he understood. She'd said what needed saying by being there. Some things didn't require words. The years passed. Ray's continued her work in the archives, now with a slightly different job title that reflected her actual expertise in classified aviation programs. She advised on declassification decisions, helped younger officers understand historical context, and occasionally provided consultation on new aircraft development without ever revealing specifics of what she'd flown. She never gave interviews, never sought attention, never stopped being exactly who she'd always been, a warrior who did the work because it needed doing without regard for recognition or reward. But now when she walked the Pentagon's corridors, officers saluted her first, not because regulations required it, but because respect demanded it. And when young pilots, especially young women, asked if they could speak with her, she made time. Brief conversations, practical advice, no dramatic stories or inspirational speeches. Just honest assessments from someone who'd done it, who'd survived it, who'd proven it possible. Lieutenant Park, the F-35 pilot who'd approached Ray's at the ceremony, went on to become the first woman to command an Air Force fighter squadron. In her promotion speech, she thanked Ray's by name, acknowledging the path that had been cleared. Ray's wasn't present for that speech, but she heard about it through the networks that connected military aviators across generations. She filed it away mentally, another small confirmation that the decision to accept recognition had been correct. The world moved on. New conflicts emerged. New technologies developed. New warriors stepped forward to face challenges their predecessors couldn't have imagined. But in the quieter corners of the Pentagon, in the archives and secure facilities where history was carefully preserved, Reyes' story remained. Not as propaganda, not as inspiration divorced from reality, but as evidence that the work could be done, that excellence transcended gender, that the military strength came from every warrior who chose to serve. And sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings when the Pentagon's day staff had departed and the night crew was settling in, Reyes would pause in her work and look out the windows at the Washington sky. She'd remember what it felt like to fly through impossible weather, to push aircraft beyond their supposed limits, to know that lives depended on her competence and precision. She didn't miss it exactly. She'd made her peace with the transition to ground-based life. But she remembered it clearly, held onto those memories as proof that she'd been more than she appeared, that her life had meant something beyond the ordinary. And that was enough. Not glory, not fame, not headlines or documentaries or ceremonies. Just the quiet knowledge that when her moment had come, when warriors needed saving and circumstances demanded the impossible, she'd been there. She'd done it. She'd proven it possible. Some nights, Admiral Holloway, now retired and living in Virginia, would stand in his backyard and look at the same sky. He'd think about the night in the Balkans, the impossible rescue, the warrior he hadn't known. He'd think about how close history had come to losing her story entirely, how easily she could have remained anonymous forever. Then he'd remember the salute, the ceremony, the ripples of change that followed. And he'd smile, satisfied that at least once he'd gotten it right.